So now we also have to touch on your baby that you love. That basically you started this distillery to do.
Right.
You want to talk about it and kind of introduce it because it's a very new topic for a lot of people.
Yeah, so single malt whiskey has been, I love whiskey in general, but single malt, I would say, for whatever reason, it resonated with me, at an early age, like early 20s, I found it was, it's just so exciting. The fact that the tradition, going back to Scotland, Ireland, the UK, and the mystique for me, there's some kind of magic in good single malt Scotch whiskey, right? So then knowing that places like Westland Distillery in America, there's a new category I'm part of, we're American single malt producers. So trying to build, much like there are laws governing bourbon whiskey and 51% corn, new charred white oak barrels, etc. American single malt is trying to follow strict guidelines, much like Scotch single malt Scotch whiskey. So very simple barley yeast water. I look at it a lot like a single vintage wine, that's made from one grape variety. So a varietal wine. This year, these grapes pulled all this minerality. The sun was right. The harvest was perfect. There was low stress on pests and mold, mildew. It's the same with single malt whiskey, I believe. So what's fun is to work with farmers and really try to, because growing malting barley in New York City is very difficult.
Sure.
And I feel lucky. I'm working with some amazing farmers, some very local, some a little bit further out, about like an hour and a half away. And we're all working with, so Hartwick College does all the testing, and there's a conference, Cornell is part of it, Cornell University, and New York State is really trying to figure out how can we grow good malting barley, because the brewers, there's a huge demand obviously with breweries, and now with bourbon, any whiskey, rye whiskey, bourbon, you don't have to use malt, but traditionally malt was what you used to use those enzymes to convert all the starch to sugar to then ferment, right? So malt is always, if you look at any Kentucky bourbon, they're going to have malting barley, So we're seeing that New York State isn't quite meeting, I think, the demand that's coming. So that's been exciting anyway. It's one other aspect, and it's fun to work at the grassroots level, growing what will then be made into whiskey here in the distillery. And I don't know, there's something so elemental and simple, a lot like the maple distillates. It's very clean, very simple, it's from the ground, it's sunlight, it's stored in barley, it's stored in the maple syrup and sap, and then you're converting all that sugar into alcohol, and then it too is kind of this special, magical thing that you save. And a lot of times winter, for whatever reason, it's cold, we have a fire in the wood stove, you want something that warms you, and that sunlight is then cracked open from the bottle again.
Sure.
And it's kind of magical for me to see, to know the farmers, know the fields, go visit the barley as it's growing, to then bring it in as kind of like an honor, like how can I take this effort that you did and all your work that you're proud of, and then I take it and I make something that's then passed on and taken home with other people. And that's kind of why raising spirits in the Finger Lakes became kind of our motto and our mantra, because we're trying to elevate the discussion but also raise people up, uplifting, make it inspired,
Sure. So when you're comparing it to like a bourbon or a basic whiskey, is the difference within the distillation process, or is the difference within the growing process?
So a little bit of both, and then a whole nother mash bill. So every whiskey has its own governing laws, let's say. Some of them are looser than others, but single malt whiskey, American single malt whiskey, barley yeast water, right? 100%. Nothing. That's the mash bill. All barley malt. Bourbon has to be 51% corn or more by law in the mash bill. All the other elements you can play around with. So you can do 51% corn, you can do 30% malt, and the rest can be rye, or rye and wheat, a 4-grain, or it can be a high rye. So you can go high rye, and the rest of your mash bill can be 100% corn, as long as it's 51% corn or more. So bourbon is kind of all over the map in terms of what the mash bill can be, where single malt barley, or American single malt is 100% barley. And so that's a big factor. So it's all barley flavor. And so, yes, there's different distillation. Definitely my cuts on the still, the way I do my first run, the way I'm run in, your tails, there's a lot of flavor in tails. There's also things that, I don't want to geek out too much, but obviously you've got many different alcohols, many different compounds, fusel oils, all these things that'll come off on a still, and you can use those as an artist to your advantage. Your stripping run kind of is going to determine what your palate is in your final distillation run when you make those tight cuts to your heart. And so it's kind of like, you have to plan ahead. You have to say, what do I want my bourbon? What do I want to come forward in that bourbon? And bourbon, I feel like, is much oilier. It's got a different mouthfeel than Scotch whiskey or single malt whiskey does. And part of that, I think, is that corn element. It's got, and also the barrel is charred, where single malt whiskey is usually going into a used barrel, because it's like a tea bag. You take something delicate like barley yeast and water. It doesn't have all that big oil and bold flavor, like maybe rye, the spice of rye with the oily corn, that's going to hold up to something that's charred. It needs. I've had single malt whiskey in a charred oak barrel, and it's not good, because it just overpowers it.
Sure.
So when you take a bourbon cask freshly dumped, it's charred, yes, but it's been used like a tea bag, still has some flavor in it, but it's now softer. And because single malt is typically aged longer, you really have the ability to age it long, and it doesn't change so drastically like a bourbon might. You might change in a month. You go back and taste that barrel, and it's totally different. Where single malt, I feel like, is slower, more delicate, softer aging. And then you can put it in another cask to finish it, whether that's sherry or X wine, or Pinot Noir, whatever, some fun options. Rum.
Don't get me started on rum.
Yeah.
So, have you had any experimental single malts yourself, just like off the record, trying to figure out like how this would even go? How did those work out?
You mean, have I done them, or have I tried others?
No, you.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
So your first attempt, was it like, well, I got some work to do? Or?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
No. Yeah, definitely. And part of it too is it's a little tricky with single malt. You were talking about production, and I forgot to. So with single malt whiskey, you're taking the liquid. When you mash in, it's actually called lautering. It's like a brewery would do. False bottom on your cooker. So a false bottom is like a strainer. I showed you guys the mash tun. All that liquid is called wort, and that liquid you drain off through the barley, and that is what you ferment. Bourbon is all grain in, so it's all the corn, it's all ground up, it's mashed in, it's then fermented all with the grain. So that is a little tricky with single malt because when you lauter that barley, you want the hulls that you use a roller mill with barley, right? Because you want it to crush the hull of the barley. You don't want it to grind it into powder. Sure. If you're making bourbon, it's okay to grind it into a powder because you're not using it as a filter bed. You just want all those enzymes ground up. So it's not as tender a process as lautering barley. So you want to crush that hull to open the starch up, but you want the shell of the barley to also act as a filter.
Sure. That
all that wort drains through. And if your temperatures aren't right, your strike temp isn't right, your enzymes, you can ruin things in a hurry. You're trying to basically get those enzymes, find the temperature that's going to work for both your main enzymes, beta and alpha, enzymes, to break all that starch down and make it into sugar. Mm-hmm. So you can get some off flavors if your, water temp is big, the way you're draining your wort. Brewers will tell you it's very finicky. You want to take your time, low and slow, and you really don't want to be mixing that grain bed up a whole lot when you start draining your wort. So yeah, those first attempts were something wasn't, I just kept playing, or, you're not cooling your wort fast enough. You're not, sanitizing is a huge thing for everyone making beverage alcohol.
Sure.
So yeah, I made some funky, and I also got some bad grain. There's a lot of, like, fusarium is a bacterial, and grain, just like grapes can mold, can pre-sprout. You can have some bad grain. Corn can be all over the map. I've had really bad corn, and that flavor comes. You can't take something that tastes awful and make something good by, I don't care who you talk to. So you really have to start with high quality grain or fruit, and you have to be very careful about the process. Otherwise it can go off the rails in a hurry. It's not just like throw it all together and hey,
right,
run it through the still and it tastes great,
Sure.
And
So talking about Scotch too, and
Yeah.
and how it relates. So everybody that associates Scotch, they think of peat moss and that heavy peated flavor.
Yep.
Does American single malt have that in there? And if so, where does it come from? Because I'm assuming you're not burning peat to dry
Nope.
it out. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, you are? Okay.
You are. So